Hi, Saints and Strangers. That's actually the name of the book about the pilgrims and other people coming over on the Mayflower. There was more than just those trying to escape persecution. Anyways, I wanted to say hi. Today's July 19, 2020. We are still under this coronavirus craziness. I don't know when that will ever end. Nobody seems to know. We were hoping the heat of summer would kill it out, but it doesn't seem to have happened. So I haven't taught in class. We hadn't been to church since the middle of March. We saw some friends yesterday. It was wonderful to see them after 4 months. Church actually started back yesterday, but I have such a hard time wearing the mask. I can barely make it to the store without feeling like I'm gasping for breath. And the heat, that just makes it worse. And wearing a mask, it just exacerbates the heat and makes it worse. Anyway, I wanted to share another story with you since it's been a while and it didn't look like we were going back anytime soon. It's rained here today. We got home and it had rained, which my tomato plants are happy. We should get some little cherry tomatoes before this month is out, and I'm grateful for that. We're still pretty much staying away from everybody, and it's really hard. I'm not gonna lie about it. It's really hard. So anyway, I thought I'd read to you about Esther, the brave queen, since the last story I would have taught about would have been about young Esther, and then the next week would have been about the older Esther in our timeline. But since we didn't have any camp meeting, we didn't have any more class after March, so I've kind of missed it, but I've tried to keep myself busy. I got a keyboard, so I've been playing that, learning how to play that all over again, because I used to play the piano when I was younger, and I wish I hadn't quit, but I got tired of it and my parents didn't make me keep going. So I've been trying to do that. I've been busy with some other projects. I've been doing a lot of cooking since I've been out of work. Almost a year. The end of September will be a year I've been out of work, and I'm enjoying being at home with my husband, and he has gotten to really like my cooking, and I've gotten better at some things. So without further ado, I'm going to read to you about Esther, the brave queen. So this is book 4, and we're reading about Esther, and it's found in Esther 1-10. Hadassah was an orphan girl. She sat alone on the doorstep of her empty house because there were tears in her eyes. She could not see the blue of the sky, the green of the grass, nor the yellow gold of the flowers. Here she is, in her mud brick house. Mordecai, Hadassah's cousin, came to her house. "Come, Hadassah," he said. "Come live at my home." Hadassah gathered up her clothes and tied them into bundles. She was pleased to be going with cousin Mordecai to live with his family in the town of Shushan. Now maybe I don't pronounce everything the way you would, but this is the way I grew up learning Bible stories. The pastor in church, when my parents read them to me, and like these books, my mom read them to me until I was old enough to read them myself, and I've always loved them. But also, we had Bible stories on tape, and I still love to listen to those. And people wonder how I knew so much about the Bible, and that's one of the things, because there was always church, there was story time every night, and because of the Bible stories. Mordecai and Hadassah walked along the dusty road. Hadassah's sandals made small footprints in the dust. Mordecai's sandals made very large footprints. Now Hadassah could see the blue of the sky, the green of the grass, the yellow gold of the flowers, because no longer were there tears in her eyes. Here she is, and you can see the footprints they left in the dust. And you can see the winding road they're going to be taking. Mordecai worked for the king of Persia. Every day he sat in the gate of the king's palace and answered the questions of the people who came asking for help. Hadassah sometimes carried lunch to Mordecai as he sat in the king's gate. "Here's your lunch, cousin Mordecai. Pomegranates and cheese and bread with honey." That sounds like a good lunch, don't you think? There's some of the statue. Now, I was reading to you about Daniel, and Daniel was under Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Well, after Babylon, Medo-Persia took over, and the Medes and the Persians. And this is just talking about the Persians. So the Persians overcame the Medes. And so that's where we're at in the story. Hadassah grew to be a very pretty girl. She was such a happy, helpful girl that Mordecai said she was like a shining light. No longer shall your name be Hadassah, it shall be Esther, which means a star. And he's pointing out the window at a star. And it looks like her aunt here. Esther liked her new name forever and always. She would try to shine as a star. Esther, Esther, Esther. Over and over she said her new name. You probably wondered where the story was going when I said Hadassah, and you're thinking, who is that? Well, Hadassah is a Hebrew name, and Esther is more of a Persian name, I believe. And for one reason that he changed her name was what is going to happen now. She was chosen. Now it happened that the king of Persia was planning to choose a queen. Gather together all of the most beautiful maidens in the land, said the king to his helpers, that I may choose a queen from among them. Esther was one of the maidens called to the palace. Mordecai watched them as they came through the gate. He thought there was none so beautiful as Esther. There's Mordecai, and can you find Esther? She's the only one looking to him. And they're being taken. Maiden after maiden was presented to the king. All of them were beautiful, but when the king saw Esther, the shining star, he said, Esther shall be queen. With his own hands, the king placed a crown on Esther's head, a golden crown with pearls. Here he is crowning her queen. He kind of looks like King Joash in the one story I read to you. This is actually back here a little way. I'll show you his picture. See, and he's sitting on the throne. That kind of looks like him, and I always thought these stories were intertwined. And in the story of Daniel in the lion's den, the queen is actually wearing an outfit, and I thought, hey, that's Esther. But she happened, I think, several years after Daniel. He might have still been alive, but I don't know. Queen Esther went to live in the queen's house in the palace gardens of the king. From her window, she could see cousin Mordecai as he sat in the king's gate. And here she is reading, and here's Mordecai out here in the gate. Esther read the king's list of palace rules. There was one very strict rule. It said that no one must go in before the king unless invited. If anyone did go in without being invited, that person would be put to death, unless the king held out the golden scepter to him. Pondering over these rules as she's reading them. Look at, these are like their books. They were called scrolls. And they didn't have books like we have nowadays. You know, they're all bound together. They didn't have those. They were just rolled up. A terrible thing happened in the land of Persia. A law was passed that on a certain day all of God's people would be killed. Mordecai sent a messenger to Queen Esther telling her, you must go in before the king and ask that God's people be saved. And here's the messenger telling her. She looks all worried. And I thought, where's Mordecai? But he is actually the one they call the sackcloth. They would also put ashes on their head. See him there, and the people are sad. And when they were dressed like that, they were not allowed to go see royalty. They couldn't come in. That's why he sent a messenger to her. I dare not go before the king unless I'm invited, said Esther. If the king should not hold out the golden scepter to me, I would be put to death. No, I cannot go in before the king. She's looking all worried because remember, she read the rule. She can't go in there without being invited. In the Bible, it goes into more detail. She could not, unless the king had called her within the past 30 days. She couldn't go in. And apparently he hadn't. Mordecai again sent a messenger to Esther saying, "Don't be afraid. Maybe God has let you be queen for such a time as this." So there's the messenger bringing her the note. Queen Esther replied, "Appoint 3 days of prayer, and then I will go in before the king and ask him to save God's people. If I perish, I perish." Esther and her maids prayed in the queen's house. Mordecai and his friends prayed in his house. All through the land of Persia, God's people prayed. See, and you've got Queen Esther and her maids, and you've got Mordecai and his friends, and then you've got everybody else down here praying. There's just a few people in that picture, but trust me, they were meeting everywhere. Carefully, Queen Esther made herself ready to go in before the king. She used her sweetest smelling perfumes and put on her prettiest royal robes. Then she and her maids said a last prayer. Slowly, they walked down the long hall to the throne room of the king. The king heard someone coming. He scowled. Who would dare come before him uninvited? "Take that person away," he was about to say, when there's Queen Esther. She's coming with her maids and her 2 servants. And on the other side of the door, you can see the king. And he doesn't look very happy. And there's his servants. They're getting ready to take the person away. When he saw it was lovely Queen Esther who had come to see him, the king smiled at her and held out what? The golden scepter. Esther came near and touched the scepter. See, everybody's kind of anxious over here. And then she touches the scepter, and everything's all right. "What is thy request, Queen Esther?" asked the king. "It shall be given thee even half of the kingdom." Now, the king wasn't really giving her half the kingdom. That was just his way of being very generous. It was just like one of those things people say. Esther invited the king to come to her house to a special dinner. At the dinner, she would ask the king to save God's people. And so it came about that the king made a new law and God's people were saved. Messengers, some on mules, some on camels, others on horses, still others on foot, raced through the land spreading the glad news. God's people shouted for joy. So here they are. This guy's going out on a camel. These guys are on horses, and I think this guy might be on a mule. You can't see the head. Oh, it's this guy against the wall. You can't really see him. He's on a mule. The feet are different, and so is the tail. And here's Mordecai back in his regular clothes at his post. And there's Queen Esther, and she's making sure that they're doing taking the good news to all her people. Perhaps the happiest of all was Queen Esther, once Hadassah, the orphan girl, then Esther, the shining star, and now Esther, the brave queen. But she was very brave. She says, "If I perish, I perish." She was going to go to the king, just as she promised. And on the cover of the book, you've got Mordecai and Esther, well, Hadassah back then. And then this is probably when she was getting ready to take the meal to Mordecai at the gate. It's her aunt, and she's got the basket, and she's getting ready to follow the road into the city to the king's gate. And well, there's a little more to the story. There was a bad guy named Haman. Some men had conspired to kill Mordecai, and Mordecai had overheard it, and he told a messenger who told Queen Esther, and they got the message to the king. Well, after that, the king hired somebody to look after his security, Haman. And Haman, the king said that you have to bow before Haman. Well, Mordecai was a worshiper of God. He wasn't going to bow before anybody except God. And that made Haman angry. And he goes home, and his wife said, well, you know, he's just one guy. Why don't you build a gallows and have him hung from it? And so he's thinking about this, and he's like, yeah. And he finds out Mordecai's a Jew. Well, he finds out that Mordecai's not the only Jew. There's a lot of people named Jews. Now, this is one thing that Mordecai had done. He'd renamed Hadassah Esther. Now, if her name had still been Hadassah, they would have known right off she was a Jew. But since her name was Esther and she became queen, nobody knew. So, after she became queen and Haman had been appointed, Haman got to thinking around about these Jews. He said, well, Mordecai's a Jew. There's a lot of Jews. They don't worship anybody but their God, whoever he may be, because he was what they call a pagan. He didn't know about God, and obviously didn't want to know. So at a party that the king threw, the king was very apt to throw parties. He and Haman were talking, and Haman said, look, I have some business. And the king said, well, this is a party, can it wait? He said, no. And he said, well, there's some, okay. So he said, there's a group of people in your kingdom that they only have one God, and they only obey him. And and so I think that they're not helpful to your kingdom. So here's what should be done. They should be destroyed, and you won't have to pay a penny of it. You know, we'll put the money that we get from them in the royal chamber. Well, the king, anything that doesn't cost a lot of money was good for him. Because, see, at the beginning of Esther, the king had thrown a giant party. And he had a very beautiful queen named Vashti. And the women had their own parties separate from the men. Well, at the end of the week, the king wanted the queen to come out. Well, there's a lot of drinking at parties. And people that get drunk, a lot of times they lose their inhibitions. Like, maybe there'd be some things that you wouldn't do, like jump off a really high cliff into the water, or drive really fast down the road, or just take a chance that you wouldn't normally. And so the king was drunk, and he had said, well, bring in the queen, tell the queen to come here and wear her crown, the crown on her head, and parade before me. And she refused. She said, I'm not going to come parade before the king. You know, he's going to show me off. Well, he asked his counselors, what am I going to do? They said, well, you should ban her from coming into your presence anymore, because when men hear about this all over the kingdom, their wives are going to do the same thing. So he banned her. Well, when he got sobered up and he thought about it, he's like, I really miss her. Well, he's getting ready to go to war. And so he asked his advisors, I really miss my queen, and I got to go to war. So what do you suggest? And they said, well, let there be, you go ahead and go to war. But while you're gone, here's what we're going to do. We're going to set up a beauty pageant for you. We're going to pick the most beautiful women. They're going to get a whole year of treatments. They're going to get perfume baths. They're going to get makeup, makeovers, everything to make them beautiful. And when you come back from your war, or whenever you're done, we'll parade them before you, and you can pick which one you want. Pick a new queen. That sounded like a good idea. So the king went off to war. Well, he lost the war. This is King Xerxes, or Artaxerxes, whichever version of the Bible you have. And so he goes off to war, and he loses. So this time to have the women parade before him was the perfect time, because he was depressed about the war and he needed something beautiful. Remember, he didn't have his queen. So that's when Esther was taken. She didn't volunteer and say, oh yeah, I'll go. And they didn't come through and say, who wants to go, or who's going to go. They chose them. I don't know if it was a form of kidnap or what, but she was taken. And so she became queen. And since her name had been changed to Esther, nobody knew she was Jewish. So when this story comes along, Mordecai gets this edict, and he tears his clothes and he puts ashes on his head. That's the sign of mourning. And he sits outside the palace. Now remember, Esther could see him, and so she sent a messenger with some fresh clothes, telling him to put them on and come tell her what the deal was. Well, the messenger came back probably with the clothes and the message and a copy of the edict. It said all the Jews were going to be killed. And she must have had a good poker face, because nobody ever knew that she was Jewish. And she must have, I'm sure she blushed a little, was like, oh no, my people and everything. And so it came back and saying, this is what Haman's going to do to the Jews. And that's when Mordecai, her cousin, said, you need to go in and ask the king. She said, well, he hasn't asked for me in over 30 days, and if I go in, he's going to have me killed. Well, he said, well, you're our only chance. Maybe nothing will happen to you while you're queen, and maybe you'll get away, but somebody else will rescue the Jews. He was sure that the Jews would be rescued. He said, somebody else will rescue the Jews, and then, after you're not queen anymore, something could happen to you. So she said, okay, gather everybody together, pray and fast for 3 days. Doesn't mean they probably didn't go without water. You can't go without water for a lengthy period of time, but they probably did pray. Some people will not eat or drink during the day, but at night they will eat. I don't know how exactly it was, but it's possible that they just had some water and just prayed and didn't eat anything for 3 days. But you can live for several days without food. So after the 3 days were up, she said, I'm going to go into the king to ask, and basically she's saying, wish me the best of luck, because I could die. If I perish, I perish. So she dresses up and she goes into the king, and of course he puts out his golden scepter, and he says, what can I give for you? And she invites him and Haman to the banquet, because she knows that he's the one that's done this. So they go to the banquet, and they have a good time, and halfway through, or 2/3 of the way through the banquet, the king says, all right, Queen Esther, what can I give to you? It's yours to half of my kingdom. He's still being generous. And she says, I want you and Haman to come back to a banquet tomorrow, and there I will tell you what is really on my mind. It's like, okay. So they leave. Esther goes back to her little palace, her part of the palace, and the king goes to whatever he does. Well, Haman heads home, and on his way home, he sees Mordecai, and it really gets his ire up. And I misquoted. He had not decided to build the gallows then, but when he went home, that's when his wife and his friends told him to build a gallows. That's when he came up with the idea. He wanted to get rid of not only Mordecai, but all the Jews. And now Mordecai's gotten so much under his skin, he just can't take this. He can't wait for Mordecai to be taken out with the rest of the Jews. He wants Mordecai to get taken out now. So they said, why don't you go ask the king if you can hang him on a gallows, have a gallows bill. So he sets guys to work that very night. And I got a bug on my nose. And so the next morning he decides to get up early and go ask the king. So he goes, gets up early in the morning and heads to the palace, and he waits for the king to get up. Well, that night the king didn't sleep very good, and I think God had something to do with this. So what the king has happened, he has a book read to him of his things that he's accomplished. So if you've ever written down a a list of accomplishments you've made. You could have somebody read it to you. Well, apparently his accomplishments weren't that interesting, because he had somebody read it to help him fall asleep. So while they're reading it to him, he's laying there getting ready to nod off, and all of a sudden he hears these two guys. There was an assassination attempt by these two guys. Mordecai the Jew found out about it, had word sent to Queen Esther, and through her, word was brought to you that there was an assassination attempt, and so it was recorded. And then he goes on to the next thing, and the king's awake now, and he said, wait a minute, what did Mordecai get for this valor this plot he uncovered? What did he get for that? And they say, well, nothing. He said, you mean he didn't get a reward? He said, no. And he's like, oh, I can't believe this. So then he asks who's waiting in the outer chamber, because he figures it's somebody that will come up with a good idea. Now remember, Haman came in early. Haman showed up early to ask if he could hang Mordecai. Now remember what the king just heard. So he calls Haman into his court, and he says, and Haman wants to say, I have something to ask of you. Well, the king says, first things first. I'm the king, I'm going to go first. I'll tell you what I need. He says, what shall be done to a man the king delights to honor? Well, Haman's greedy, and he is thinking, the king wants to honor me, right? Because I'm his second in command. I'm like the head of the security and everything. So he says, well, first of all, you need to take for this guy, get the king's horse, get the king's robe, a robe worn by the king, and put it on this guy. Get a crown that the king wears, and put him on a horse that the king rides, and take him through the streets saying, this is how the person that the king wants to honor is treated. The king says, that's a good idea. I want you to do that to Mordecai. Oh man. Haman's like, oh no, I wanted to hang this guy, and now the king wants to honor him. I can't ask him to hang him now. So he goes to Mordecai, finds him probably with a servant, dresses him in the robe, puts the crown on his head, puts him on the horse, and has him ride on the horse, and he leads the horse through the streets and says, this is what happens to those who honor the king. This is whom the king delights to honor. Oh, this had to be so embarrassing for Haman. He wanted to kill this guy, and now he has to walk in front of him yelling this. Oh, it had to have been the worst day of his life. Well, the day wasn't over yet. So he does all that and takes him back to the palace, probably puts him in the hands of servant, and runs home. He's like, oh, honey, Zeresh, that was the name of his wife. Zeresh, you'll never believe what happened to me. He's in the middle of this, and he wants to know, oh, by the way, did you finish with the gallows? And remember, he still wants to hang Mordecai. And the servants say, no, we're not done yet. And he says, well, let me know the moment they're done. Okay? And so then another servant shows up and says, by the way, it's time for you to go to the palace. It's time for your banquet with the king and Queen Esther. So he's like, well, at least I have that to look forward to. So he goes off to the palace and goes to the banquet. And they're about halfway through the banquet, or 2/3 of the way through. And the king asks Queen Esther, he says, what do you need? What do you want? Up to half of my kingdom, it's yours. And this is when she says, I pray for the lives of me, and not only me, but of my people, for we are sold like slaves. Now, he wants to know who, what are you talking about? She says, I'm a Jew. And he says, who sold you And she said, this wicked Haman. And this upsets the king, because not only does he find out his wife is Jewish, but that he had agreed to this idea. The mosquitoes are out. He had agreed to this idea of killing them, and gave Haman the power, gave him his signet ring to put this word into law, this law into effect. And something about the law of the Medes and the Persians, it can't be changed. Remember when Darius signed that signed the law for nobody to bow to him, anybody but him, for 30 days. It could not be changed, even for his best friend Daniel. Well, King Xerxes is in the same boat. He can't change the law. So he's so distraught, he goes out into the garden. He goes for a walk. Have you seen some of the beautiful gardens? There's flowers. Have you ever seen pictures of Versailles in France, in Paris, France, or the White House? There's beautiful gardens there. Some of these rich houses, the Biltmore Estate, I've been there a couple of times, and they have beautiful gardens. And so this is where the king goes. He goes out to the garden to think. Well, Haman is left with Queen Esther, and he suddenly decides this is his last chance. He has to beg for his life. So he goes over to a couch that she's on. Oh, these people eat kind of reclining. You know, I've seen a picture where the table was like in the middle, and they kind of recline with their feet away from the table, so they're kind of like on their elbow, and they're eating. Obviously they're not eating like a 12-course meal. They're probably eating grapes and some meat like chicken or something, dates, almonds, nuts. They might have had some fish. Whatever they were eating, she was laying on a couch, and Haman goes over there and starts begging, starts pleading, I'm so sorry, you know, almost for his life. And he starts getting on top of her, and she says, get off me. And the king comes back in then, and he says, what is going on? Are you attacking the queen? Will he attack the queen in front of me in my own house? And about that time, remember Haman's previous words, about that time, Haman's servants come in to let him know that the gallows is built, 75-foot gallows. Now that's really tall gallows. Sometimes when things are really big, my mom and I would plot them out at home. We'd put a rock at the starting place and walk. And then you walk 75 feet, and that's how tall that thing was. Now imagine somebody hanging by their neck. You're obviously going to see it in the city. Everybody can go out on their roof or their front door, and they're going to see 75 feet up in the air. So the king says, well, that's good. That's convenient. Hang Haman on it. And what they did at that time, they took a cloth and they put it over, the servants put it over the head of the person condemned. So they took Haman out and they hung Haman on the gallows. So then he, what the king does is he promotes Mordecai. He puts Mordecai in the position that Haman was. And then he asks the queen, what do you want? I'll give it to you half the kingdom. She wants the edict, she wants the law taken back where the Jews would die. Well, he says, I can't do that. And so they ask Mordecai, and they come up with an idea where they can make a new law where the Jews can defend themselves. And that's exactly what they do. When the day comes, the Jews defend themselves, and hardly anybody that's a swallowed mosquito, excuse me. Hardly anybody goes out against the Jews, and those that do are injured very badly. They know better than to do this. And on your calendar, you might see the name of a holiday, usually around the first of the year, called Purim. It's spelled P-U-R-I-M. And it's actually pronounced Purim. And it signifies that it's a celebration of the day that the Jews celebrated that they defeated their enemies. they cast a lot, or a pur, a pur, I think. I'm not Jewish, I don't know. I know a few Hebrew words. But they cast the lot, the pur, and that's where that word comes from. And so the Jews were saved through Queen Esther. And if not for her action and Mordecai's help, she was an orphan, so he did help her there, and he gave her advice. If not for that, somebody else would have done it, like Mordecai said. They would have saved the Jews. But if they had not, we would not have Jesus, because Jesus came through the Jewish line. And that was before they came back from Babylon, before they got back to Judah. So that's the story of Queen Esther. I hope I haven't bored you and put you to sleep. And just hope you're doing okay. Hope everybody's well and doing okay and having a good hot summer. And I'm hoping and praying this virus will go away very soon. It is very hot. It's like in the 90s here where we're living. Thankfully we have a bit of a breeze sometimes, and you can hear the air conditioner running. So I hope you're all doing well and taking care. And I will try to do another video soon. Alright, bye. See you in the next one.